on
I can.
no one was here, but you guys are Baruch Hashem.
All have a good Yontif?
Thank God, so far so good. And you?
Yeah.
Excellent.
Agree with that?
Excellent. Baruch Hashem. Okay, good to be here. I swapped with Rabbi Bachner today. Just in case you're wondering, it's not Wednesday. So Rabbi Bachner will teach tomorrow. It's great to see everyone. So we're onto a new book since last time we learned together, which is Laws of Sanctity. And the current laws are what referred to as the those prohibited sexual relationships, because we are going to encounter some unusual possibilities of relationships, or we certainly have already. We're going to encounter very detailed descriptions of what would make a woman tamei or not, and some radical kind of possibilities perhaps. So again, we'll take things in stride. A few things to keep in mind: not always is the halacha in practice like the Rambam. So it's always important to get final decisions when we're talking about practical Jewish law from a competent rabbinical source today that will take into consideration, the other opinions that are actually followed, and to recognize that sometimes cases, although extreme, are brought really to establish, if you want, principles and so on, that we can be clear about those principles, even if the circumstances are rather unusual. And even if, when possible, we're never really encouraged. So many of the things that we discuss nowadays are completely not even considered. But even at times when it was considered, was strongly discouraged and unusual. Okay, so that's just a little bit of a disclaimer when we talk about these very sensitive laws. I think, though, underlying all of this is a recognition that Torah is very aware of human nature, understands our most basic instincts, and ultimately also wants us to find refinement and sanctity by controlling our behaviors, right? So, of course, beyond learning the laws today, the whole concept of forbidden sexual relations, and particularly nida, which primarily is in practice within a marriage, which is otherwise a permissible relationship, reminds us that even within the permitted, we seek to better our most basic instincts. And through that, we find sanctity. Okay, so I'm going to share the screen and we'll go into the halachot of chapter 5. I'm going to turn my head slightly because I've got it on my separate screen here, but we'll read along. Once again, we'll stick just to the English. I find that we get through it. So a woman becomes impure due to factors beyond her control, whether for nida or for ziva. Yesterday, in yesterday's chapter, we introduced the idea of nida, which is primarily speaks about the regular menstrual cycle of a woman. But a woman can become nida or ziva, which is also a flow of blood from the body and an unexpected time, even at times when things are kind of beyond her control. So what are examples? She jumped from place to place, or she saw animals, beasts, or fowls copulating and was aroused and began bleeding. In these and in other analogous instances, regardless of the situation she experienced bleeding, she becomes impure. In other words, whatever initiated the flow of blood, and we'll define exactly where that flow comes from, that she is now in the status of nida. She becomes impure, even from the smallest amount of bleeding. Even a drop of blood the size of a mustard seed would make her impure, as if much blood had drained from her. So if it is defined as blood from the uterus, as we'll see, even the smallest amount would render into a state of nida. Halacha 2. All women become impure when blood is discovered in the outer chamber of the vagina. The Rambam is soon going to share expressions that our rabbis use to define different parts of the woman's anatomy, so we can understand what exactly is being spoken about. But she says a woman becomes impure when she discovers the blood in the outer chamber of the vagina, even though the blood did not emerge outside of her body. Now, this is an exception. Usually a person only becomes impure with contact outside the body, but But in this instant, because the impurity is initiated from within, even if it doesn't actually flow completely beyond the vaginal canal, she would already become in a state of nida as soon as it reaches the so-called outer chamber of the vagina. Right? But instead was discharged from the womb without flowing further. Since it emerged from the upper portion of the vaginal canal channel, she is impure, even though the blood is still within her flesh. And as the verse says, a discharge of blood from within her flesh. So it is an exception, but that is the halacha. Until where does the upper portion of the vaginal channel extend? So he gives an indication until the place that the male organ reaches when inserted entirely during relations. The upper portion of the vaginal canal, its channel itself is like the uterus. And now he's going to explain what we're talking about over here. He says, our sage have spoken in metaphoric terms with regard to a woman, meaning the anatomy of that part of the woman's body. The uterus, where a fetus is formed, is called the source. It is the place where the blood that renders a woman a nida or a zava emanates from. It is called the room, for it is found deep within her body. The entire uterine channel, meaning the lengthy place whose entrance contracts severely at the time of pregnancy, so that the fetus will not fall, but opens very wide at the birth, is called the antechamber. Okay, so that's the birth canal and the portion between, so to speak, the uterus and the outer extremities of the vagina. And this is considered like a gateway to the uterus. Okay, and we're going to see that itself is divided or into kind of two parts. When the male organ is inserted entirely during relation, it enters the antechamber but does not reach its end. Instead, it's slightly removed, and this would depend on the size of the organ. Above the room and the antechamber, located between the room and the antechamber. It doesn't, in other words, it will reach somewhere in between. And that place, this is the place where the woman's two ovaries and the ducts in which her ovum become mature are located. This place is called the loft. So this is above. Now, there's an open, like an attic. There's an opening from the loft to the top of the antechamber. This opening is called the passageway, where the male organ is inserted during relations. Sorry, when the male organ is inserted during relations, it goes beyond the passageway. Okay, so we defining different places, so to speak, within the female anatomy. Now, blood which comes from the room, so that's the uterus, is always impure with the exception of the blood of purity. The blood of purity is a reference to the blood that may flow after childbirth. We distinguish between after the birth of a male child is after 7 days and female child is after 14 days, which the Torah deemed pure. And a second exception would be bleeding, which occurs before birth, as will be explained. We'll deal with this within later halachot. But otherwise, any blood that emerges from the uterus is considered impure. Blood from the loft is entirely pure. It is like the blood from a wound in the intestines, the liver, or a kidney, and the like. Okay, the following, how we're going to determine where the blood comes from is for obviously will be discussed. The following law applies when blood is discovered in the antechamber. If it is discovered between the passageway and the uterus, she is impure. For the assumption is that it came from the room, in other words, from the uterus, and then because she's considered nida, she's liable for entering the temple. In other words, she's not allowed to go in there. And if she touches truma or sacrificial food, you'd have to burn it because it's considered that she's imparted that tumah to it. We don't say that perhaps it descended from the loft through the opening, for most of the blood found in such a place comes from the uterus itself, from the so-called room. When blood is found in the antechamber between the opening and the entrance of the vagina, she is impure because of a doubt. Because although it could have perhaps come from the so-called loft or the uterus, but we have to treat it as if it is tameh because there's a doubt. Perhaps the blood came from the room, or perhaps it flowed from the loft through the passageway. Therefore, we do not now. So that means basically she has to consider herself as tameh. She should not enter into the temple. She should not touch truma. But if she did, there's no necessity to burn it. And if she did go into the temple, she would not be held liable for that. Halacha 6. Not every liquid that comes from the room renders a woman impure. Okay, so although we said all blood, other than the two exceptional times, but not every liquid that comes from the uterus is considered impure. Because the pasuk says there must be a discharge of blood. Therefore, if a white or a green liquid flows from the uterus, even if it is it's viscous like blood, she is pure since it does not appear as blood, even if it's the same kind of density of it. Okay, it must be blood. Now, so how do you know if what emerged is blood or not. You'd have to be able to look at the color of what this discharge is and determine. So there are 5 colors of blood that render a woman impure. They are red, black, bright saffron, muddy water, and diluted wine. All other colors are pure. And the Rambam is going to explain a little bit how we would determine these colors. I should just say that, as we go, this becomes practical even today, where an occasion, within a marriage, if a woman has to determine if she's had some type of discharge from her body and she's not certain if it's niddah or not, so an expert would have to look at it. And so there's rabbinic training to determine these colors, to be familiar with the colors, and to know when such a discharge would render the woman niddah or not. But these are the basic fundamental rules around it and the basic colors that are dealt with. So halacha 8, what is meant by red? So red would be considered blood for certain, and if a woman discharges, she would be tameh. What is meant by red? The color of blood that comes from the blood which flows initially when people let blood. This blood is placed in a cup, the stain is placed next to it, and the two are compared. The black is like dried ink. So red is like, if you look at blood that has just been drawn from the body, and that same color. What is meant by bright saffron? So this is how you're going to figure it out. He says fresh saffron should be brought together with the clod of oil from which it is growing. From the better stalks, one should take the middle stalk that is entirely a stem. In each one, there are 3 stalks, and each stalk has 3 leaves. So one should bring the stain next to the middle leaf on the middle stalk and compare it. Okay, that's obviously how saffron grows. And the one in the middle is going to have the purest color, and that's the one that we would compare this discharge to. What is meant by like muddy water? So we take earth from the valley of Sichne, or the like, which is red. So it's a red type of sand, and pour water over it until the water level is the thickness of garlic peel above the earth. So really just a touch more. There is no required amount of water or earth that must be poured. And as whatever you use, just make sure that the amount of water you're putting in is just that much above the earth. Then you stir them in a container and compare the color to that of the stain. At that time when the water is murky. If the water becomes clear, one should stir it again. And make it work murky. In other words, if you allow it to settle, you're not going to get the exact color. You're going to mix it up again. Look at the color, and then you can compare the colors. If it's the same color, or in a moment we'll see if it's darker. In each of these instances, it's going to be considered blood and tameh. If the color of the stain matched the color of any of these 4 shades, or was deeper than them, darker, the woman is impure. If it's lighter than they are, she is pure. What is implied? If a black stain was darker than dried ink, then the woman is impure. If it was lighter, meaning it was like a black olive, tar, or a raven, so that's not a black that would render impure. She would be pure. Similar principles apply with regard to the other 3 colors. But now there's an exception. The last color that we spoke about was diluted wine. Like he says, what is considered diluted wine? He says like 1 portion of fresh undiluted wine, like the wine of the Sharon in Eretz Yisrael, mixed with 2 parts of water. If the appearance of the stain was darker or lighter than this, the woman is pure. The stain must be the exact color of this mixture. So as opposed to the other colors we said, if it's darker, it would also be considered impure. Lighter would not be considered impure. Here, this particular color is to be exact. A woman's word is accepted if she said, I had a stain of this and this color and I lost it. So then the wise man rules whether she is pure or impure based on her statement. This is an interesting halakha. But she can describe the color that she saw, and if it's determined that it's one of these colors, then she could be considered pure. Again, I'll just say here, particularly when it comes to these colors of red, so practical training is necessary nowadays, but there's very little leeway if it's red color. If there are other colors, there's more leeway. But because we're not exactly expert on the red will, for the most part, be determined as blood, whatever the shade of that red would be. Halacha 11. How does a person bring the 2 close and compare? So now if you use, we'll see soon that once someone is trained in recognizing the color, you no longer have to actually compare. But if you're still learning the colors and you have to compare it, how do you compare it? So he's going to explain that you have to have the right amount of light and exposure and so on to be able to see that the sample color is as you're seeing it correctly. How does a person bring the 2 close and compare? He takes a portion of the cloth that has the stain in his hand and looks at it and at the ink, the saffron leaf, okay, you put it together. The blood was left contained in a cup. The muddy water or the diluted wine contained in a cup. He compares them according to his perception and rules whether she is impure or pure. Okay, so the leaf you put together, the ink you bring together, and the other ones you bring it together in a cup. Now you should not look at the cup from the outside, because then it's going to be distorted, right, by the glass or whatever the material in the cup is. Instead, you should look at the liquid in the cup. The cup should be wide. Basically, what the point that he's making up here is that the walls of the cup shouldn't be so thick that it would influence the way the color looks, but it should be the weight of a money and contain two lugim, so that the light will enter it and not be shadowy. In other words, if the thickness of he's giving you a ratio over here for the thickness of the glass, that it won't distort the color. And then it should be wide on the top, and you look at the color from the top. Furthermore, a stain should be checked only on a white cloth and in sunlight. So when you do this comparison, you can't be in a dimly lit room. You've got to be in sunlight. And then ideally one should make a shadow with his hand over the stain while standing in the sun, so that you'll be able to see it as it is. That's the method that the Rambam gives us to get the best kind of truest color or appreciation for the color of the sample, and then compare the blood or the stain to that. It's not necessary for every person checking a stain to do all the above. Whenever he checks a stain, instead of sage develops a sensitive eye to the colors of the stain, right? You train yourself, you're able to see this is a color that is a problem, this is not a color that's a problem, and so on. You would only have to do this if there's a doubt regarding the appearance of a particular stain. Then you can bring it close and compare it to the blood that has been let, or to the other impure colors. But if he's confident that through his training recognizes this color, that's fine. Following rules applies when a woman discharges. Okay, this is another type of unusual discharge. He says if a woman discharges a piece of flesh from her vagina, and this is not a miscarriage, but it's considered some type of degenerative process of her inner organs. I guess this can't be a good occurrence. Obviously, must be an indication of some illness. But if she does discharge a piece of flesh from the vagina, even if it is red, she is impure only when it is accompanied by blood. If not, she is pure. Even if when the piece of flesh is cut open and is filled with blood, she is richly pure. Because again, then it would be blood from this flesh and not considered blood from the uterus, which is the impure blood. For this, right, rather the blood from the piece of flesh. Halacha 14. When the woman discharges a piece of flesh which is torn and there's blood collected within it, then she is impure. The following rule applies when a woman discharges something like a shell, or something like a hair, something like earth, or something like little bugs. In other words, it appears to be one of these things. If these entities have a red appearance, they should be placed in lukewarm water. If they dissolve, she is impure, for it was blood. They're congealed. And whenever a woman discovers dried blood, she is impure. We can assume it's coming from the uterus again. If the entities remained in lukewarm water for more than a day and then dissolved, there is a doubt whether the woman is impure. If they did not dissolve after an entire day, they are from a wound and she is pure. Okay? The following rules apply if a woman discharges something resembling a locust, a fish, a teeming animal, or a crawling animal. Okay? If it is accompanied by blood, it is impure. If not, it is pure. Impure. This is one area that's many of the other codifiers depart from the Rambam's opinion. They assume that if something that emerges with some type of shape of a creature, that it actually would indicate a miscarriage of sorts, and that would render her impure, like after childbirth. But the Rambam obviously is of a different opinion over here. The halacha 16, when a woman places a tube in her antechamber and expels blood through the tube, she is pure. Right? So somehow she inserts something that allows the blood to flow, and that because it doesn't actually touch the walls of the what we call the antechamber and so on. Because the verse says a discharge of blood within her flesh, implying that this discharge must be within her flesh, as is the ordinary way in which women menstruate. For it is not ordinary for a woman to discharge blood through a tube, and as long as it doesn't touch the inner walls, then she's not technically impure. It is pointed out by the other commentators that we've got to be certain that whatever she may have inserted is not wide enough to actually open the uterus somewhat. Because if it's wide enough, then we have to assume that itself would make her render into a state of nida. Halacha 17. When a woman urinates and excretes blood together with urine, she is pure. Okay, so this is when blood emerges, but in the process of another bodily function. And the idea over here is because the assumption then is that it's coming from a place other than the urinary tract rather than from the uterus. He says this applies whether she was standing or sitting while urinating, even if she has physical sensations and her body shudders, which at sometimes would indicate that there had been a flow from the uterus, but because it's now is discharged at the same time that she's urinating, then she need not suspect that the blood originates from the uterus. Instead, the sensation is associated with her urination, and urine does not originate in the uterus. Instead, this blood stems from a wound in the colon or the kidney, and therefore is not blood that would render her nida. Halacha 18. So now we've spoken about blood that we've clarified and determined that what type of blood renders a woman nida or zava. It's blood from the uterus. Hormonal bleeding, okay, that is pure. I'll just say again, for practical purposes nowadays, we treat really any blood, even that the hormonal bleeding, as blood from the uterus, and a woman would be rendered nida in a nida state for practical purposes. But technically speaking, and according to the Rambam, and according to the basic halakha, hormonal bleeding is pure. It is neither blood of the nida nor blood of ziva. It is not from the uterus. Instead, it is blood from a wound. What are the laws applying to virgins who suffer hormonal bleeding? Okay, so if she married when she was a minor, whether she never menstruated or whether she menstruated while in her father's home, she is permitted to her husband until the wound heals. In other words, if there's continued bleeding after the first intercourse, which can be assumed to have been the blood of the wounded hymen, as we'll see, then she continued to be with her husband. In other words, she's not considered nida. For any bleeding that she discovers stems from the wound. We assume it comes from the wound and not from the uterus. This again, remember, is a minor, a very unusual situation, but that would be the halakha. If she discovers other blood after the wound heals, she's considered nida. In other words, if she can determine that the wound had healed and then there's bleeding, then she has to assume that it is nida. The following rule applies when a woman marries when she is a nara. Remember, nara is a girl who's turned 12, not yet 12 and a half, and has some bodily signs of maturation. So if she's never menstruated beforehand, she's permitted to her husband for 4 days. By day and by night, even though blood is flowing, provided the wound did not heal. We're going to define what that means shortly. But if she has already menstruated in her father's home, meaning before she was married and had intercourse, and then married, her husband should not continue to engage in relations with her after the first time. He should separate. In other words, we assume that there's blood as well from the uterus. Hormonal bleeding is considered as if it is the beginning of menstruation. And that's the way it's treated. When a girl who has reached majority but is not menstruated, she is given the entire first night. And this obviously is also, so she's now older than 12 and a half. She's got mature, otherwise bodily signs, but has not yet menstruated. So for the first night, she can remain with her husband, even after the initial intercourse. But beyond that, she has to consider herself a nida. If she's someone who has previously menstruated, then immediately after the first intimate act, they would have to separate as nida. Halacha 20, the first 4 nights. So we mentioned earlier that the Naira, for 4 nights, she continued to be with her husband. We don't consider it to be nida blood, but rather it's just the blood of the wounded hymens and is therefore not impure. So what are we talking about when we say 4 nights? So Rambam explains that are granted, these 4 nights are granted to the Naira is not menstruated, need not be consecutive. Indeed, the couple may engage in relations the first night and wait even 2 or 3 months and engage in relations for a second night, provided the wound is not healed. Meaning, so long as, and we'll see soon how do you determine whether or not the wound has healed. But if the wound is not healed, any blood, even over those 2 or 3 months, would be considered blood from the wound and not blood from the uterus, so long as she has not yet had regular menstruation. Obviously, if she begins a regular cycle of menstruation, that would change the situation. But the point is the 4 nights is not consecutive, but can even be over a period of time. Halacha 21. Similarly, with regard to a minor who is allowed to continue engaging in relations until the wound heals, even if it does not heal for an entire year, they may engage in relations either non-consecutively or day after day, again, provided that it does not heal or that she has not started regular menstruation. The following rule applies when a girl married while she was a minor and became a nara. Okay, so if she married at 11 and a half, she had relations, so that for the first 6 months, she's allowed to, obviously, as we said, as long as she has not menstruated, any blood is considered just from the wound, and she would be permitted to be intimate with her husband. But now she becomes a nara while she's already married. So if the blood is still flowing because of the wound, all of the time she engaged in relations while a minor are considered as one night, and she's given license to complete the 4 days granted to her during the period of na'arat. Right, as we said earlier, as a na'ara, so long as she hasn't begun menstruation, she could have 4 nights together with her husband, even if they're not consecutive. So what we're saying is basically any period before she turns 12 would be considered one night, even if it was many months or weeks together. Okay, and even if the 3 days she's granted during the period of Nairut are non-consecutive, meaning they engage in relations one night every 2 months, this is permitted provided the wound is not healed. Obviously, once she's now 12 and a half, she's now considered a Bulgarian, she's no longer Naira, and then she would only be granted one night so long as she has not begun menstruation, and otherwise, obviously, begins menstruation, then she would be a nida from any blood that is discharged. Halacha 23. How do we know? Now, this is important, right? Because we said all these things that there's permission so long as the wound hasn't healed. How do you know if the wound has healed? So he says, if a woman would discover blood when she stands, but not when she sits, if she would discover blood when she sits on the earth, but not when she sits on a pillow or blanket, the wound has not healed. Okay, if however the bleeding ceases and she does not discover blood, whether she stands or whether she sits on pillows, in other words, that means even in other words, when there's some level of pressure put on that part of her body, it still doesn't bleed, then that's an indication that the wound has healed. And therefore, any subsequent blood, we have to consider as if it came from the uterus. Similarly, even if her bleeding has not ceased, but she continues to discover blood even when she is sitting on pillows and blankets, okay, we assume that this is not blood from the wound, but rather menstrual bleeding. In other words, the blood of the wound of the hymen would continue to flow if there's a bit of pressure. If she's bleeding even without any pressure, then it's an indication that this is a flow from some other place, and we assume that this is the blood of the nida. Halacha 24. If she would discover blood in the midst of relations, we assume that it comes as a result of the wound. If she engaged in relations and did not discover blood and afterwards discovers blood out of the context of relations, we assume it is menstrual bleeding. Okay? And final halacha 25. When a man engages in relations with a virgin and she does not bleed, and then he engages in relations with her again and she does bleed, we assume that this is menstrual bleeding, even if she's a minor. And the rationale is that if there were hymenal bleeding, it would have appeared the first time. In other words, sometimes there's no bleeding. And a final point, which again, this is very unusual really to make a point of the law, because we've learned that halachically, and I would assume that this is medically the case, that any penetration before the age of 3, then the hymen would actually mend itself or regrow. The point of this final point of the halacha of the Rambam is that although we say that anything that happens pre-3 years old, post 3 she would still be considered a virgin, it's not because there isn't a hymen, and that might cause bleeding, but that it would regrow. This is the halachic understanding. So therefore he says when a woman has relations with a girl below the age of 3 and she bleeds, this is considered hymenal bleeding. Okay, so that brings us to the end of today's